Welcome, horror fans, to another episode of Cabin of Horrors, where today we're reviewing one of the most acclaimed horror films of 2024, The Substance, a film that masterfully blends psychological horror with supernatural thrills. And The Substance isn't just another addition to the vast landscape of horror cinema. It's a film that challenges the genre's conventions while paying homage to its roots and really carving out a new path for the future of horror. In this review, we'll dive deep into the film's influence on the genre, how it uses and subverts familiar tropes, and the psychological complexities that make it stand out, and of course, why it's a must-watch for fans of modern horror. From the first frame to the last, The Substance keeps its audience on edge. The film doesn't rely on jump scares or the kind of overtly grotesque horror that we've come to expect in many contemporary films. Instead, it builds its tension through atmosphere, psychological complexity, and a careful balance of supernatural and human elements. And that's what makes The Substance really stand out. It's horror at its most cerebral, and it forces the audience to reckon with both the external forces at play and the internal struggle of its characters. In modern horror, it's easy to get caught in the trap of derivative storytelling, especially with the explosion of horror franchises, reboots, reimaginings. But The Substance is really a breath of fresh air. It offers a deep and unsettling narrative that feels both timeless and modern. It pulls from the past, but it doesn't simply recreate it. The influence of classic horror films is immediately apparent from the start of The Substance. But rather than feeling like a homage, the film uses these references as a framework for something new. The first film that came to mind for me when I was watching The Substance was the 1980 Stanley Kubrick film, The Shining. The isolation of the characters in a remote location, the gradual breakdown of their sanity, and the oppressive atmosphere of dread all echo Kubrick's masterpiece. Because in The Shining, the hotel itself is a character, and in The Substance, the setting really shares a similar role. It's not just the physical space in which the characters exist, it's a reflection of their mental and emotional states. The location feels like it's alive, responding to their fears and uncertainties, much like the Overlook Hotel does in Kubrick's film. But the influence doesn't stop there. The Substance also carries the psychological horror roots of Jacob's Ladder, and even more recently, Hereditary. These films have shown us that true horror is not just about what is visible, it's about the unseen and the unknown. It's about the psychological unraveling of the human mind and how trauma can manifest as external horrors. The Substance really taps into that deep, unsettling notion, blurring the line between the psychological and even sometimes the supernatural. The film also draws from the narrative complexity of The Sixth Sense, where it has an emotionally grounded human story while still blending horror elements into it. In these films, the horror is not just something external, it's connected to the personal lives, fears, and secrets of the characters. The Substance follows this model. It builds a deep emotional foundation for its story before unleashing its true horror. And like in all horror films, The Substance draws upon established genre conventions and tropes. However, what sets it apart is the way that it twists and subverts these tropes. It's a film that understands the expectations of its audience, but refuses to follow the traditional patterns and tropes of horror movies. Now let's start by setting the stage with the plot. The Substance tells the story of Elizabeth Sparkle, played by Demi Moore. Elizabeth is a former star, a once popular TV fitness instructor, who's now been cast aside by society, discarded because of her age. This immediately evokes familiar horror tropes, things like the aging star, the once famous person who's now invisible to the world. It's a theme that we've seen in classic horror films like The Stepford Wives and The Skin I Live In, where aging is a kind of death in itself, and the body becomes the site of violent transformation. In The Substance, Elizabeth is introduced to a mysterious drug, and it promises to reverse the ravages of time. But this isn't just about looking younger. The drug causes something far more grotesque. A younger version of herself named Sue, and she emerges from a split in the back of Elizabeth, and the two of them begin to share a life, switching places every week. Elizabeth gets to inhabit her youthful body while Sue takes over her older self. Now, this concept of duality, two versions of the same person, it brings to mind the psychological horror that permeates in The Shining. In The Shining, Jack Torrance is slowly overtaken by the hotel, and his identity disintegrates under the pressure of isolation, revealing a monstrous version of himself that had always been lurking underneath. In The Substance, Elizabeth undergoes a similarly harrowing transformation, but it's not just external, it's also psychological. She finds herself losing her grip on her identity. She begins to become unsure of who she really is anymore. Similar to Jack Torrance, Elizabeth is slowly consumed by her need to regain what she's lost. And just like in The Shining, the breakdown happens in isolation, and her relationship with Sue becomes increasingly toxic, more and more as Elizabeth tries to regain control over the process. And this theme of losing control of oneself, it's something deeply tied to The Shining, and it's a perfect influence on The Substance. As Elizabeth's physical form becomes younger and more idealized through the drug, her psychological state deteriorates. The isolation, both physical and emotional, become more and more apparent as the film progresses. It's a theme that we see in classic horror films all the time, where the psychological terror matches the physical terror. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the horror of the transformation itself. It's pretty monstrous, much like the changes that we see on The Fly. And the horror of The Substance isn't just about grotesque physical shifts, it's also about what these shifts do to the characters' minds. Elizabeth's body changes, but her mind unravels in parallel. Her mental deterioration is just as disturbing as her physical changes. In The Substance, Elizabeth is slowly taken over by her younger self, who, while embodying youth, also represents everything Elizabeth can't hold on to anymore. And the body horror influence in this movie is completely undeniable. There's grotesque visual effects, especially the moment when Sue first emerges from Elizabeth's back. Again, it echoes the body transformations that we've seen in The Fly, and also disturbing physical violations that we saw in Videodrome. The shock of seeing Sue's physical emergence is the stuff of classic body horror nightmares. It's just completely unsettling, almost feels wrong, which taps into that primal fear of losing control over our own bodies. And the horror just isn't in the images as well. It's also in the anxiety that Elizabeth feels. There's this constant sense of dread throughout the whole movie. Elizabeth begins to realize that her quest to regain her youth has turned her into something completely different that she doesn't even recognize anymore. So much so that her reflection in the mirror becomes more of an alien thing to her. And this idea of being haunted by one's own image reminds me of The Shining, similar to where Jack's haunted not just by ghosts, but by his own slowly disintegrating self. The performances in the movie really are spectacular. Demi Moore's portrayal of Elizabeth is a key element in making this film just completely disturbing. Elizabeth herself is a pretty complex character. She's a woman who's desperate to hold on to something that's slipping away from her. And Demi Moore channels a kind of tragic desperation here that evokes a lot of classic horror characters who become monstrous in their pursuit of beauty or youth. She's also a character driven by fear of being irrelevant, fear of being forgotten, and that makes her journey that much more harrowing. And then there's Margaret Qualley. She plays Sue, who's the younger form of Elizabeth Sparkle. Qualley brings a really chaotic and untamed energy to Sue. Her performance does a great job of capturing the wildness of youth, that whole reckless and free and completely without boundaries vibe. But as the film progresses, it becomes more and more clear that Sue's not just a carefree representation of Elizabeth's lost youth. She's also a very dark reflection of the traits that Elizabeth has buried deep down inside of herself. And this duality between Elizabeth and Sue taps into that classic horror idea that the notion of our other self is not just a reflection, but perhaps a more dangerous part of ourselves. In a way, their dynamic mirrors that of The Shining, where Jack and the hotel represent two halves of the same thing. In The Substance, Elizabeth and Sue are both part of the same entity, but they're also diametrically opposed. Elizabeth wants to keep control, and Sue wants freedom. And that's the tension that really begins to build between the two and what drives the horror of the film. The direction of the film really tackles complex themes with a lot of intensity. It certainly doesn't shy away from the disturbing aspects of the body horror genre, but also it's a way to explore larger themes of obsession, identity, and the violence that comes with trying to hold on to something that's slipping away. Visually, the film draws a lot of inspiration from the tradition of 1980s body horror. The practical effects are absolutely visceral, absolutely disturbing. Recalls movies like The Fly, The Thing, Videodrome. But there's also a very stark and almost clinical quality to the way that Elizabeth's transformation is filmed, which calls back to the detached horror in The Shining. There's this emotional coldness to Elizabeth's journey, and it just makes the horror of the movie that much more chilling. To wrap things up, The Substance is a film that blends the body horror grotesqueries of the 1980s with the psychological terror of a lot of classic films. It's a meditation on youth, obsession, identity, all wrapped up in a grotesque horror-filled package. Definitely standout performances from Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley. It's a direction that channels the best of horror history and themes that dig deep into the human psyche. I 100% give this 5 stars. It's a film that's definitely a must-watch for fans of classic and modern horror alike. And I want to thank you for joining me today on Cabin of Horrors. If you haven't seen The Substance yet, like I said, I highly recommend you check it out. But be warned, it's not for the faint of heart. And if you've already seen it, I'd love to hear what you thought. Drop me a message on social media or leave a comment wherever you're listening to the show. And don't forget to subscribe. That way you always get a notification whenever a new episode drops. And until next time, stay spooky, and I'll see you in the cabin.